London, 1890. The fog rising from the Thames usually hides many sins, but even the thickest soot couldn't stifle the scream that echoed through Mayfair that night. What you are about to hear isn't a Victorian fairy tale. It is the cold record of a crime against morality, a scandal that made the Queen herself turn her head in shame. They say love bears all things, but in a city fueled by bloodlines and cold steel, Beatrice's love for a man she was never meant to touch became her social death warrant. In an era where a woman's reputation was her only currency, she chose to burn it all for a man who worked with his hands. This is the story of a sacrifice that began with a single look and ended with blood on white satin. This is the scandal that broke London. The carriage wheels ground against the damp, uneven cobblestones of Mayfair, producing a rhythmic, bone-jarring vibration that seemed to rattle the very teeth in Beatrice's head. Inside the cramped space, the air was thick, heavy, and suffocating, smelling of her father's expensive, acrid Turkish tobacco and the faint, cloying scent of old, cracked leather. It was 1890, and London was a city divided by invisible walls of steel, bloodline, and tradition. Beatrice sat perfectly still, her spine never touching the back of the seat, as her corset, a masterpiece of whalebone and unforgiving silk, pinched her ribs until every breath was a calculated, painful effort. She was 20 years old, the only daughter of Baron Sterling, and tonight she was being delivered like a piece of fine, fragile porcelain to an auction she had never agreed to attend. Across from her sat the Baron, a man whose face was a map of fading prestige, hidden desperation, and mounting debts. He didn't look at her. He looked through her, staring at the carriage window where the gaslights of the city flickered like dying stars in the yellowish fog. To him, Beatrice was no longer a daughter. She was a strategic asset, the final currency the House of Sterling had left to trade before the creditors came knocking at their heavy oak doors. As the carriage pulled up to the grand entrance of the Cavendish estate, the sheer scale of Victorian hypocrisy became visible in the glow of the lanterns. Hundreds of carriages lined the street, and the sound of horses' hooves and the shouting of uniformed footmen created a chaotic, aggressive symphony. The estate was ablaze with light, every window glowing with the fire of 1,000 beeswax candles, while just a few miles away, the slums of the East End were drowning in soot, disease, and despair. Beatrice felt a sharp wave of nausea hit her. She knew exactly what this night represented. The season was reaching its peak, and Lord Harrington, a man with a reputation for cold, calculating efficiency, and even colder hands, was expected to make his formal move. Her father reached out suddenly, his gloved hand gripping her wrist with a force that was just short of causing a permanent bruise. "Smile, Beatrice," he whispered, his voice sounding like sliding gravel. "The entire family's future is draped in the lace you're wearing tonight. Do not let me down, or I promise you, the consequences will be felt by more than just yourself." They stepped out into the biting, damp London air. The fog, thick and yellow with coal smoke, clung to her skin like a damp shroud, chilling her to the bone despite her layers of silk. Inside the ballroom, the heat was immediate and overwhelming. The orchestra was playing a frantic, dizzying waltz, and the room was a blur of spinning silk, shimmering jewels, and false smiles. Beatrice was paraded from one circle of aristocrats to another, nodding and smiling until her face felt like a mask of dried, cracking plaster. She heard the whispers behind the lace fans as she passed. The Sterling girl. They say the father is utterly bankrupt. She looks pale, doesn't she? Like a ghost in a wedding dress. The judgment was constant, a low, predatory hum that never stopped. Lord Harrington finally appeared through the crowd, a tall, angular man with eyes that reminded Beatrice of a winter sky over a frozen sea. When he took her hand to lead her to the floor, his touch was possessive, not affectionate. He talked incessantly of estates, coal mines, and political alliances as if she were merely a silent partner in a business merger. Every minute spent in that room felt like a year of her life being stolen. The smell of expensive perfume, human sweat, and melting wax became a toxic, dizzying fog that made her head spin. "I need air, my lord," Beatrice managed to say, her voice barely a whisper against the roar of the music. Harrington frowned, his massive ego momentarily bruised by her lack of attention, but he gave a sharp, clinical nod of dismissal. Beatrice didn't walk, she fled. She pushed through the heavy, gold-trimmed velvet curtains that led to the stone terrace overlooking the rear courtyard. The transition from the golden glare of the ballroom to the deep, blue-black shadows of the London night was like coming back to life after being buried alive. She leaned over the cold balustrade, closing her eyes and letting the mist settle on her heated skin. For the first time in hours, she could actually breathe. But the silence she expected wasn't there. From the darkness of the lower courtyard, near the servants' entrance where the delivery wagons usually stopped, came a metallic, rhythmic sound. Asterisk clink, clink, clink. Asterisk, it was the sound of honest labor, out of place in this world of leisure. She opened her eyes and looked down into the shadows. The courtyard was undergoing massive repairs. A section of ancient stone wall had collapsed during the recent torrential rains. There, illuminated only by the guttering, flickering light of a single oil lantern, was a man. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo, a starched collar, or polished boots. He wore a simple, dirt-stained tunic with the sleeves rolled high above his elbows, revealing forearms that were corded with hard muscle and dusted with white stone powder. This was Arthur. He was a mason, a man of the earth, grit, and sweat, working late into the night to earn the few measly shillings that kept the hunger at bay for another day. He was a ghost in the world of the Sterlings, a necessary shadow that kept their palaces from crumbling into the mud. Arthur stopped his work suddenly, as if sensing a presence above him, and looked up. He didn't have the practiced, subservient gaze of the household staff or the fearful eyes of the lower class. He looked at her directly, his eyes sharp, intelligent, and observant even in the dim, flickering light. Beatrice should have turned away immediately. A lady of her standing had absolutely no business acknowledging a common laborer, especially not at midnight in the shadows of a city where rumors spread like a plague. But she was transfixed. In his gaze, there was no judgment, no social expectation, and no hidden greed. He saw the girl, not the title or the dress. He saw the way her hands trembled as she gripped the cold stone railing. "You're far from the music, my lady," Arthur said. His voice was deep, carrying the rough, honest edge of the London streets. But there was a surprising, quiet gentleness to it that caught her off guard. Beatrice felt a jolt of pure electricity that was more terrifying than any of her father's threats. "The music is too loud," she replied, surprised at her own boldness, her voice steadying for the first time that night. "And the air in there, it's too thin to breathe." Arthur stepped closer to the base of the balcony, moving slowly into the small circle of lantern light. His face was rugged, marked by the hard, unforgiving life of the working class, but his features had a raw, masculine symmetry that made the men inside the ballroom look like pale, weak imitations of humanity. He wiped a smudge of stone dust from his cheek with the back of his hand, leaving a dark trail of gray on his skin. "The air is always thin up there," he said, gesturing with a calloused hand toward the glowing windows of the ballroom. "Down here, it's heavy with the smell of the city, but at least you can feel it in your lungs." That was the exact moment the scandal was born, not in a secret bedroom or a darkened carriage, but in that simple, dangerous exchange of words between a woman who had everything and nothing, and a man who had nothing but himself. They talked for what felt like minutes, but in the rigid reality of 1890, every second was a catastrophic betrayal of her class. Beatrice found herself telling this total stranger things she hadn't even admitted to her own reflection. About the paralyzing fear of her upcoming marriage, the crushing, invisible weight of her father's expectations, and the terrifying feeling that her soul was being slowly erased by silk and etiquette. Arthur listened with a quiet, powerful intensity. He didn't offer empty, aristocratic platitudes. Instead, he told her about the London she didn't know existed, the world of the docks, the bustling night markets, and the people who actually built the bricks and mortar of the world the aristocrats merely inhabited. Their conversation was abruptly interrupted by the sound of the terrace doors creaking open behind her. It was her father's voice, sharp, impatient, and laced with suspicion, calling her name from the darkness of the ballroom's edge. "Beatrice, where have you wandered off to? Lord Harrington is asking for another dance." "Go," Arthur whispered, stepping quickly back into the deep shadows of the stone wall. "The cage is calling you back." Beatrice lingered for a single heartbeat, her heart racing so fast it felt like it might burst through her ribs. She felt a desperate, irrational urge to climb down the trellis, to ruin her expensive white silk dress in the mud, and to simply vanish into the London fog with this man who spoke to her as if she were a human being. Instead, she straightened her skirt with trembling fingers, wiped a stray, cold tear from her eye, and stepped back toward the golden light. But as she walked toward her father, she knew with a terrifying certainty that she was no longer the same person who had entered that estate. The seeds of a dangerous defiance had been sown in the dark. Arthur stayed in the shadows, silent and unmoving, watching her go. His heavy stone hammer rested in his hand, a symbol of the strength he possessed. He knew the danger better than she did. He knew that a man like him and a woman like her were viewed as two different species in the eyes of the law and the church. But he also knew that he had seen a fire in her eyes that he couldn't forget, a fire that was waiting for the right spark to burn the whole city down. As the gala continued into the early hours of the morning, Beatrice moved through the crowd like a sleepwalker in a dream. She danced with Harrington again, but she no longer felt the pressure of his hand or heard the sound of his voice. She was thinking only of the man in the courtyard, the honest smell of stone dust and rain, and the way the lantern light had caught the strength in his shoulders. The scandal wouldn't stay in the shadows for long. She knew that. In a city like London, secrets were the most valuable and dangerous currency, and someone was always watching from the corners. The servants, the carriage drivers, the jealous rivals, they all had eyes, and they all talked. And Beatrice Sterling, the supposed jewel of Mayfair, had just looked at a commoner with a gaze that promised to ruin everything her family had built for generations. The night finally ended with the Baron forcing a triumphant smile as Harrington kissed Beatrice's cold hand, a silent, binding agreement of sale. But as the Sterling carriage pulled away into the misty dawn, Beatrice looked back at the darkening estate one last time. She saw the silhouette of the stone wall being painstakingly rebuilt, and she knew that her own walls, the ones built by society, by her father, and by her name, were finally starting to crack. The sacrifice of Beatrice had officially begun, and 1890 London was about to witness a romance that would break every rule, destroy every reputation, and end in a tragedy that would be whispered about for 100 years. This was only the beginning of the end, and the price of her freedom was going to be paid in blood. The following week, London was gripped by an unseasonable heatwave that turned the city's usual damp chill into a stifling, oppressive humidity. Inside the Sterling Manor, the air felt even thinner than usual, thick with the scent of floor wax and unspoken threats. The engagement to Lord Harrington had been officially announced in the Times, and Beatrice felt as though a black shroud had been draped over her life. Her days were now a grueling blur of dress fittings with French tailors who pricked her skin with pins, floral arrangements that smelled like a funeral, and cold, instructional meetings with her mother about the duties of a wife. Her mother, a woman whose soul had long ago been crushed by the weight of her own corset, spoke of marriage as a tactical retreat, a way to survive the winter of their family's bankruptcy. But every night, when the house finally fell into a heavy, uneasy silence and the servants retreated to their cramped attic quarters, Beatrice would sit by her window, watching the yellow street lamps flicker in the haze. She wasn't looking for the stars. She was looking for a sign of the man from the courtyard. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, during a rare and desperate moment of unsupervised freedom, her chaperone having fallen ill with a seasonal fever, that Beatrice took a risk that would have made her father's blood run cold. She didn't dress in her usual silk. She chose her simplest, darkest gown, a deep charcoal wool that made her look like a shadow. She covered herself in a heavy, hooded cloak that obscured her golden hair and the distinct, aristocratic tilt of her chin. She slipped out through the kitchen garden, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had memorized the name on the side of the masonry wagon she had seen that night. Lowe and Sons, Smithfield. To a woman of her rank, Smithfield was not a place on a map. It was a descent into the bowels of the city, a place of slaughterhouses, blood-stained cobblestones, and the raw, unapologetic pulse of the working class. The journey by hired hansom cab was a terrifying revelation. As the carriage moved east, the wide, polished boulevards of Mayfair and the manicured parks of the elite gave way to narrow, soot-choked alleys where the sun seemed to never reach the ground. The smell of expensive Turkish tobacco and lavender was replaced by the overwhelming stench of raw meat, wet sawdust, and coal fire. When she stepped out onto the uneven cobblestones of Smithfield, the noise was a physical blow. The frantic shouting of butchers, the lowing of terrified cattle being led to their end, and the iron-rimmed wheels of carts clattering over stone with a deafening roar. Beatrice felt small, dangerously conspicuous, and utterly out of place. She pulled her cloak tighter, her eyes darting between the faces of men whose skin was etched with the grime of a dozen years of labor. She found the yard of Lowe and Sons tucked behind a row of crumbling, soot-stained brick warehouses near the market. There, amidst jagged piles of limestone and massive slabs of unpolished granite, she saw him. Arthur was lifting a heavy block of marble, his muscles straining under a shirt that was damp with sweat and clinging to his back. He looked like he was carved from the very stone he worked. When he turned and saw her standing at the edge of the yard, a ghost in a dark cloak, he dropped the chisel he was holding. It hit the ground with a sharp, metallic ring. He didn't approach her with a bow or the rehearsed grace of a gentleman. He walked toward her with a look of pure, unadulterated shock that quickly shifted into a fierce, protective urgency. "Are you completely mad, Beatrice?" he whispered, his voice low and jagged, pulling her quickly into the deep shadows of a nearby tool shed, away from the prying, curious eyes of his fellow workmen. "If you're seen here, your life, the world you were born into, is over before the sun sets. They don't just gossip about women like you. They destroy them." "It's already over, Arthur," Beatrice replied, her voice trembling but grounded in a certainty she had never felt before. "The life they've planned for me is a slow, suffocating death in a house made of ice. I came here because I couldn't forget. I couldn't go back to pretending that the music and the lace were enough. No one has ever looked at me the way you did. You saw the person under the name." Arthur looked at her for a long, silent moment. His rugged face, marked by the hard life of the London streets, softened in a way that was more intimate than any touch. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek, hesitating as he saw the white stone powder and the dark grime on his skin. He was a man who knew his place in the world, and his place was not next to a sterling. But Beatrice didn't flinch. She took his hand, her soft, pale fingers interlacing with his calloused, powerful ones, and pressed his palm against her cheek. The contrast was a scandal in itself. The daughter of a baron and a common stonemason, connected by a touch that defied every law of God and man in 1890 London. In that cramped, dark shed, surrounded by the smell of iron and dust, the heat of the city and the danger of their situation vanished. There was only the electricity of their skin and the terrifying realization that they were falling into an abyss from which there was no return. Over the next 2 weeks, they began to meet in secret, using the chaotic, indifferent fog of the London night as their only ally. Arthur would wait for her in the darkened, echoing corners of St. Paul's Cathedral or under the damp, dripping arches of the bridges that spanned the black, oily waters of the Thames. These weren't the polite, chaperone meetings Beatrice was used to. There were no tea sets, no polite observations about the weather. These were raw, desperate hours spent huddled together against the cold, talking about a world that neither was supposed to inhabit. Arthur spoke of a London that was built on the backs of men like him, a city of strength, of real hunger, and of a strange, fierce freedom that the aristocracy could never understand. He spoke of his dream to move west, to a place where a man's worth was measured by the calluses on his hands rather than the antiquity of his crest. Beatrice, in turn, confessed the rot inside her own world. She spoke of the sacrifice, how she was being sold to Lord Harrington to pay off her father's gambling debts and bad investments. She told him how Harrington looked at her like a piece of livestock, a breeder for his heirs and a trophy for his mantle. "I'm a prisoner of my own name, Arthur," she whispered one night as the rain lashed against the stone pillars of London Bridge. "I would rather starve in the streets with you than spend another night in that house." But London is a city of eyes and ears, and secrets are the only currency that truly matters in the slums and the parlors alike. A flower girl at the corner of Smithfield had noticed the lady with the expensive boots. A handsome cab driver had recognized the sterling crest on a hired carriage that stopped too close to the docks. The whispers began small, like a single spark in a field of dry straw. In the exclusive gentlemen's clubs of Pall Mall, men began to exchange knowing glances and cruel jokes about the sterling girl's new hobby. In the drawing rooms of Mayfair, the fans fluttered with newfound malice as the rumors reached the ears of the matrons who controlled the social registers. Lord Harrington, a man who valued his cold, untarnished reputation above all else, was the last to hear, but his reaction was the most devastating. He didn't respond with the sorrow of a jilted lover. He responded with the calculated, simmering rage of a man who had discovered a flaw in a prize stallion. To him, Beatrice's defiance wasn't a matter of the heart. It was a breach of contract. One evening, as Beatrice crept back into the Sterling Manor through the servants' entrance, she found the library doors standing wide open. Her father was waiting for her, sitting in his high-backed leather chair, silhouetted by the dying, red embers in the fireplace. He held a letter in his hand, an anonymous tip, written in a cramped, vengeful script. He didn't scream at her. He didn't even stand up. He spoke with a terrifying, quiet venom that chilled her more than the midnight fog. "You have dragged our name through the literal gutters of Smithfield, Beatrice," he said, his voice a low hiss. "You have consorted with a beast of burden, a man who smells the earth and the sewer. Do you have any idea what you have done to this family? Harrington knows. The whole city knows. I have finally found something real, father," she said, her voice steady despite the paralyzing terror coiling in her gut. "I have found a man who doesn't want to own me, but to know me." The Baron stood up then, his shadow looming large and monstrous against the rows of leather-bound books. "You will not speak of him again. You will marry Harrington on the 1st of the month, and you will do so with a smile on your face, or I will see you committed to an asylum before the week is out. As for your mason, do you think he is safe? I have already seen to it that he is blacklisted from every masonry yard in the country. He will not find work from here to the coast. He will starve in the streets, and I will make sure you are there to watch his spirit break." Beatrice was dragged to her room and locked inside. The windows were nailed shut from the outside the next morning, and a guard was placed at her door. She was a prisoner in a house of gold. But her father had underestimated one thing: the desperation of a woman who had finally tasted fire. Through a sympathetic scullery maid, a girl who had her own secret heartbreaks, Beatrice managed to smuggle a final, frantic message out to Arthur. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a declaration of war. They would flee. They would leave the soot, the steel, and the suffocating scandal of London behind. A darker shadow is falling over the city. Lord Harrington has not spent his time in prayer or reflection. He has used his vast wealth to hire men from the East End. Men who don't care about law or morality. Men who carry lead pipes and sharpen knives. He doesn't just want his property back. He wants a blood sacrifice to wash away the stain on his honor. The sacrifice of Beatrice was no longer just a metaphorical thread of social ruin. It was becoming a physical reality that would stain the cobblestones of London red. The plan was set, but in 1890, the city was a labyrinth of betrayal, and the cost of freedom was about to be paid in full. The isolation within the Sterling Manor was not a silent one. It was filled with the psychological warfare of a dying class. For 3 days, Beatrice was kept behind the heavy oak door of her bedchamber, the rhythmic sound of the nails being driven into her window frames still echoing in her mind like the closing of a coffin lid. Her mother visited once a day, not to offer comfort, but to deliver cold lectures on the volatility of female emotions. She spoke of the family's impending ruin as if it were a physical weight Beatrice had intentionally placed on her father's shoulders. The Baron, meanwhile, stayed in his study, drinking heavy amber brandy and meeting with men who didn't belong in Mayfair. Men with scarred knuckles and eyes that saw only profit. The scandal was no longer a whisper. It was a roar in the London social circles. And the only way to silence a roar in 1890 was through a massive, public display of submission. Beatrice spent her hours paced the length of her room, her silk slippers wearing a path into the expensive Persian rug. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Arthur's face, the smudge of stone dust on his cheek, the terrifying honesty in his eyes. She knew the clock was ticking. The wedding to Lord Harrington was only days away, and she could already hear the phantom sound of the church bells, which to her sounded more like a funeral dirge. The only link to the outside world was Mary, a young scullery maid with a soot-stained apron and a heart that hadn't yet been hardened by the cruelty of service. It was Mary who brought the news that Arthur had been attacked outside the Smithfield yard. 3 men, hired by unknown hands, had cornered him in an alley. He had fought like a lion, Mary whispered, but they had left him bleeding in the mud with a warning. Stay away from the bird in the cage, or the next time, you won't wake up. The news didn't break Beatrice. It forged her. The fear that had paralyzed her for years evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged resolve. She realized then that this sacrifice of Beatrice wasn't just about her losing her freedom. It was about Arthur losing his life. That night, she convinced Mary to smuggle in a pen and a scrap of parchment. With trembling hands, she wrote the instructions for their escape. They would meet at the docks of Rotherhithe, a place where the fog was thickest and the law was a distant memory. They would board a cargo ship bound for the Americas, leaving behind the titles, the debts, and the blood-soaked expectations of the British Empire. It was a desperate plan, a suicidal gamble, but it was the only path that didn't lead to a slow death in Harrington's bed. When Mary returned the next day, she didn't just bring a response from Arthur. She brought a warning. The city was crawling with Harrington's watchers. The Lord had placed a bounty on any information regarding the Masons' movements. But Arthur's message was simple. I will be there. I would walk through hell to get to that dock. Don't look back. Beatrice hid the note inside the lining of her corset, the paper scratching against her skin, a constant, painful reminder of the stakes. The day before the wedding arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum. The house was a hive of activity. Florists were hauling in massive arrangements of white lilies, the flowers of death, Beatrice noted bitterly, and the kitchen staff was working through the night. The Baron was in a strangely triumphant mood, believing he had finally broken his daughter's spirit. He allowed her a final walk in the walled garden, accompanied by 2 footmen who stood like statues at the gate. Beatrice used this moment to study the walls. She wasn't looking at the roses. She was looking at the heights, the shadows, and the timing of the guards' rotations. She knew that at 2 in the morning, the house would be at its most vulnerable, exhausted by the preparations for the great event. However, while Beatrice was planning her escape, a deeper betrayal was being woven in the shadows of the manor. Mary, the scullery maid Beatrice trusted, was being watched. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose loyalty to the Baron was born of 20 years of cold service and a fear of the poorhouse, had intercepted one of the notes. Instead of confronting Beatrice, she had taken the information directly to the Baron. The trap was set. They wouldn't stop Beatrice from leaving the house. They would let her lead them directly to Arthur. The Baron didn't just want his daughter back. He wanted to eliminate the infestation that had corrupted his asset once and for all. He contacted Harrington, and together they orchestrated a night that London would never forget. As 2 in the morning approached, Beatrice didn't sleep. She sat in the dark, wearing a sturdy traveling suit she had hidden beneath her bed. She had packed nothing but a small locket with her mother's portrait, the only thing of value she truly owned. When the clock struck 2, she moved with the silence of a ghost. Using a heavy iron fire poker, she pried at the nails in her window. The wood groaned, a sound that felt like a scream in the silence of the night. but the wind rattling the eaves muffled the noise. One by one, the nails gave way. She pushed the sash open and felt the cold, rain-scented air hit her face. It was the smell of freedom, but it was also the smell of the Thames. She climbed out onto the trellis, her fingers catching on the thorns of the climbing roses. She didn't feel the pain. She dropped to the grass, her heart thumping so loudly she was sure the guards at the gate could hear it. She moved through the shadows of the garden, using every bush and statue for cover. When she reached the back wall, she found the loose stone Arthur had told her about during one of their secret meetings. She pushed, and a section of the rotting wood gave way. She was out. She was on the streets of Mayfair, alone in the dead of night, a fallen woman in the making. She began to run. Every shadow looked like a man with a knife. Every gust of wind sounded like Harrington's voice. She reached the main road and flagged down a passing hansom cab, throwing her only gold ring at the driver. "Rotherhithe, and don't stop for anything." The driver, a man who had seen enough of the night's dark dealings to know not to ask questions, whipped the horse into a gallop. The carriage lurched through the fog, passing the grand monuments of the city that now felt like gravestones. Beatrice stared out the window, her hand clutching the note in her corset. She was going to him. She was going to Arthur. But as the carriage approached the docks of Rotherhithe, the atmosphere changed. The grand stone buildings of central London were replaced by skeletal cranes, rotting timber warehouses, and a stench of low tide and stagnant water. This was the end of the world. The cab pulled up at the entrance to Pier 14, and Beatrice stepped out into a thick, swirling mist that swallowed the light of the few oil lamps. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice lost in the creaking of the ships and the lapping of the water against the pilings. A figure emerged from the fog. Her heart soared. It was the broad-shouldered silhouette she knew so well. "Arthur, I'm here. We have to move quickly. The ship is." But the figure didn't move toward her with open arms. As it stepped into the dim light of a lantern, Beatrice's blood turned to ice. It wasn't Arthur. It was Lord Harrington, dressed in his finest evening wear, looking as if he were attending a gala rather than a dockside ambush. Behind him, emerging from the shadows of the warehouses, were her father and a dozen men carrying heavy wooden clubs and iron bars. "A beautiful night for a stroll, wouldn't you say, Beatrice?" Harrington said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. "Where is he?" Beatrice demanded, her voice cracking. "What have you done with him?" Her father stepped forward, his face twisted in a mask of disgust. "You really thought you could escape us? In this city? We own the docks, Beatrice. We own the ships, and we own you." He signaled to his men, and they dragged a battered, bloodied figure from the darkness of a nearby shed. It was Arthur. He was barely conscious, his face a map of bruises, but when he heard her voice, he struggled to lift his head. "Run, Beatrice, run," he wheezed, the sound of his voice breaking what was left of her heart. The betrayal was complete. Men had been forced to talk, and the notes had been a roadmap for their own destruction. Harrington stepped closer to Beatrice, his eyes gleaming with a sadistic triumph. "The wedding is still on for tomorrow, my dear. But first, you're going to watch as we settle the debt this animal owes to the Sterling name. A lesson in class, if you will." The men close in on Arthur, and Beatrice is held back by her father's iron grip. The fog of London, which she had hoped would be her shroud of protection, was now a witness to a slaughter. The scandal that had started with a look about to end in a massacre, and the sacrifice of Beatrice was no longer about her future. It was about her soul. The hammer was about to fall, and the sound would echo through the history of London forever. The sound of the river lapping against the rotting wood of the pier was the only thing that filled the silence after Harrington's ultimatum. Beatrice felt the world fracturing around her. Her father's grip on her arm was like a vice, his fingers digging into the soft flesh above her elbow with a strength fueled by years of repressed rage and the terror of losing his status. She watched, paralyzed, as the men Harrington had hired, shadowy figures smelling of gin and cheap tobacco, tightened their circle around Arthur. Arthur was on his knees, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps that whistled through a broken rib. Even in the dim, flickering amber light of the dockside lanterns, the blood on his face looked black, a stark contrast to the pale, dust-covered skin she had come to love. This was the reality of London in 1890. There was no mercy for those who defied the architecture of class. Harrington stepped forward, the silver head of his walking stick gleaming like a predator's eye. He didn't look like a man about to commit a crime. He looked like a man performing a necessary, albeit tedious, chore. He looked at Arthur not as a rival, but as an infestation that had crawled into his private garden. "You see, Beatrice," Harrington began, his voice smooth and devoid of any human heat. "The problem with people of his kind is that they mistake a lady's temporary boredom for a genuine invitation. They forget that they are made of different clay." He turned his gaze to Arthur and, without warning, swung the heavy cane. The sound of the silver head connecting with Arthur's shoulder was a dull, sickening thud that made Beatrice scream. The sound was swallowed by the thick fog, lost in the vast, indifferent expanse of the Thames. Arthur didn't cry out. He only grunted, his body sagging further toward the salt-crusted planks of the pier. Beatrice fought against her father, kicking and scratching, her expensive silk skirts tearing as she struggled to reach the man who had given her a reason to breathe. "Let him go," she shrieked, her voice cracking with a desperation that stripped away every ounce of her aristocratic breeding. "Take me, kill me, do whatever you want, but leave him." Her father's response was a sharp, stinging slap across her face that sent her head spinning. "Silence, you pathetic girl," the Baron hissed, his breath hot against her ear. "You have already cost us enough. You will watch this, and you will learn what happens to those who forget their place. This is for your own good. This is how we protect the name you tried so hard to destroy." The men moved in then, a coordinated mass of violence. They didn't use guns. They used hands, feet, and iron bars, tools of the trade for men who lived in the shadows of the docks. Each blow that landed on Arthur felt like it was striking Beatrice's own heart. She watched as he tried to defend himself, his movements slow and uncoordinated from the previous beating. He managed to grab the leg of one of the attackers, pulling him down, but 3 more were on him instantly. It was a slaughter disguised as a lesson. Harrington stood back, adjusting his silk-top hat, his expression one of mild boredom. He was a man who had never worked a day in his life, yet he was presiding over the destruction of the strongest man Beatrice had ever known. The injustice of it was a physical weight, a poison that filled her veins. She saw Arthur's eyes through the blood, a momentary flash of that same intelligent, fierce fire she had seen in the courtyard, and she knew he was fighting not for his life, but for the memory of the few hours of freedom they had shared. He was dying for a look, for a conversation, for the audacity to believe that a stonemason could love a baron's daughter. Suddenly, the air was punctuated by the shrill, distant blast of a steam whistle. The cargo ship they were supposed to board, the SS Victoria, was signaling its departure. The sound was a mocking reminder of a life that was now impossible. As the ship's engines began to thrum, vibrating through the very planks beneath their feet, the violence reached a fever pitch. One of the men raised a heavy lead pipe, aiming for Arthur's head, and Beatrice found a strength she didn't know she possessed. She bit down hard on her father's hand, drawing blood, and as he yelped in pain and momentarily loosened his grip, she lunged forward. She didn't go for Arthur. She went for Harrington. She grabbed the heavy locket from her neck, the one containing her mother's portrait, and swung it with all her might, the sharp edge of the gold casing catching Harrington across the cheek. It wasn't a fatal blow, but the shock of being struck by his woman, sent him staggering back toward the edge of the pier. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. The hired thugs paused, surprised by the sudden outburst of the doll they were supposed to be guarding. Beatrice didn't stop. She threw herself onto Arthur, shielding his battered body with her own. Her white traveling suit was instantly stained with his blood, the silk soaking up the red nectar of his life. "If you kill him, you kill me," she roared at the circle of men. "And then you have nothing. No marriage, no alliance, no money. You'll be nothing but a bankrupt murderer. Father." The Baron stepped forward, his face a mask of purple rage. His hand raised to strike her again, but Harrington held up a hand. Blood was trickling down his cheek from the cut Beatrice had given him, and for the first time his calm was broken. His eyes were wide with a dark, twisted realization. He didn't want Beatrice anymore, at least not as a wife. He wanted her as a trophy of his dominance, broken and subservient. "Enough," Harrington said, his voice trembling with a cold fury. "The Mason stays, but not like this." He looked at his men and gave a slight, chilling nod. They grabbed Arthur and dragged him toward the very edge of the pier, where the black, oily water of the Thames swirled in hungry eddies. Beatrice screamed, her fingers clawing at the wood as she tried to hold on to him, but she was pulled back by two of the thugs. "No, no, Arthur." The sound of his name was the last thing he heard before they threw him. There was a splash, a heavy, final sound that seemed to echo forever in the fog. The water closed over him, and for a moment, the surface was still, save for the ripples that spread out toward the waiting ship. Beatrice collapsed. The air left her lungs, and a darkness began to creep in at the edges of her vision. She stared at the spot where he had disappeared, waiting for him to resurface, waiting for the strength she knew he had to bring him back to her. But the seconds turned into a minute, and the river remained a cold, indifferent grave. Harrington walked over to her and knelt in the mud, oblivious to his ruined trousers. He gripped her chin, forcing her to look at him. "He is gone, Beatrice. He is a ghost now, just like the rest of the scum in this river. Tomorrow, you will put on your veil. You will walk down the aisle of St. George's, and you will never, ever mention his name again. If you do, I will find everyone you have ever spoken to, that made Mary the driver of your carriage, and they will join him in the mud. Do you understand?" Beatrice didn't blink. Her eyes were dead, the fire that had been ignited in the courtyard finally extinguished by the black water of the Thames. She didn't cry. She didn't fight. She was the porcelain doll again, hollow and cold. She looked past Harrington, past her father, toward the silhouette of the SS Victoria as it slowly pulled away from the dock, its lights disappearing into the fog like fading memories. The walk back to the carriage was a funeral procession. Her father walked behind her, his head down, the reality of what he had allowed to happen perhaps finally sinking into his hollow chest. But it didn't matter. The sterling name was saved. The debt would be paid. The scandal would be buried under the weight of a high society waiting and a life of gilded misery. As the carriage door closed, sealing her back into the cage of lavender and tobacco, Beatrice looked at her hands. They were covered in Arthur's blood, the dark stains already beginning to dry and crack in the creases of her skin. She didn't wipe them. She pressed her palms together, feeling the ghost of his warmth, a secret sacrament that she would carry into her marriage. The city of London moved on around them, the markets opening, the coal fires being lit, the million souls of 890 unaware that a woman had just lost her soul at the edge of the water. Back at the manor, the house was silent. The lilies had been arranged, the champagne on ice, and the dress, the white satin masterpiece, was hanging in her room like a phantom. Beatrice allowed the maids to strip her of her ruined clothes. She didn't speak as they washed the blood from her skin, her body moving with a mechanical precision. When they were finished, she sat at her vanity, staring at the reflection of a stranger. The Beatrice who had run through the fog was dead. The Beatrice who had loved a stonemason was at the bottom of the river. What remained was a shell, a weapon forged in the fires of betrayal. She looked at the heavy gold ring Harrington had given her, sitting on the marble tabletop. It looked like a shackle. As the sun began to rise over London, casting a pale, sickly light over the rooftops, Beatrice finally closed her eyes. But she didn't sleep. She was listening to the sound of the city, the sound of the stones being laid, the sound of the world being built by men who were never supposed to be loved. She knew that the sacrifice of Beatrice was not over. It was only changing form. Harrington thought he had won. Her father thought he had survived. But they had forgotten one thing about the people of the earth. Stone doesn't break easily. It weathers the storm, it endures the frost, and when it finally falls, it crushes everything beneath it. The wedding was a few hours away, and London was waiting for its scandal to be resolved. But as the first bells of the morning began to chime, Beatrice felt a cold, sharp blade of purpose settle in her heart. She would walk down that aisle, but she wouldn't be a bride. She would be a ghost, and she would haunt every corridor of Harrington's life until the day he wished he had stayed in the light of the ballroom. The sacrifice was complete, but the vengeance was just beginning. The morning of the wedding dawned not with the glory of a new beginning, but with the cadaverous, sickly pallor of a day of judgment. London was shrouded in a peace stupor, a fog so thick and yellow with coal soot that the spires of the churches seemed to float like ghosts upon a sea of sulphurous ash. Inside Beatrice's bedchamber, the silence was absolute, a heavy and suffocating vacuum broken only by the rhythmic, aggressive scrape of silver-backed hairbrushes and the terrifyingly loud rustle of heavy white satin. The maids moved like shadows, their faces pale and their eyes downcast, carefully avoiding the hollow gaze of the bride. Beatrice sat before her mirror, but she didn't see herself. She saw a monument to obedience, a porcelain shell perfectly carved and painted to salvage the honor of a bankrupt name and a father's shattered pride. The wedding dress was a masterpiece of Victorian excess, a 10-foot train of ivory silk, thousands of hand-stitched seed pearls, and lace so fine it looked like a spider's web. But to Beatrice, it weighed upon her shoulders like armor made of lead. Every layer of petticoat, every bone of the corset, and every yard of silk felt like a fresh shovelful of damp earth being thrown onto her coffin. She was being buried alive in Mayfair. Baron Sterling entered the room at precisely 10 o'clock. He smelled of stale brandy and the desperate, metallic scent of a man who had narrowly escaped the gallows of death. His face was a mask of cowardly relief, mixed with a forced, pathetic authority. He did not ask for her forgiveness. He did not mention the screams at the docks or the sound of the Thames swallowing the only man who had ever looked at his daughter with respect. He merely offered his arm, a mechanical, stiff gesture that sealed her fate as a traded commodity. Beatrice took her father's arm without a shiver, her hand as cold as the stone Arthur used to carve. She could smell the decay of his character, and for a fleeting moment, a wave of violent nausea threatened to break her mask, but she swallowed it down until it burned like acid in her throat. She was beyond physical pain now. She had reached a state of crystalline numbness. The carriage that carried her to St. George's Church was surrounded by the curious and the cruel. The scandal of the Sterling girl and the Mason had seeped into every gutter and every velvet-lined tea room in the city. The crowds gathered along the route, their breath visible in the freezing air, hoping to see the fallen angel who had dared to dream of a life outside her cage. As she stepped out of the carriage, the cold London wind whipped her veil, and for a split second, the scent of the river, that metallic, brackish smell of the Thames at low tide, struck her senses. It brought back the flash of Arthur's eyes, the intelligent fire that had been extinguished in the dark. She walked down the center aisle of the cathedral, the stone floor echoing with each step. The air was thick with the scent of white lilies, hundreds of them, their cloying, funeral aroma filling the nave. She walked under the weight of hundreds of condemning stares, the whispers of the aristocracy hissing like snakes in the pews. Lord Harrington waited for her at the altar, looking like a gargoyle in a mourning coat. There was a frozen, sadistic triumph in his thin smile, and his eyes held the predatory gleam of a man who had finally broken a wild animal. The scar on his cheek, where her locket had sliced his skin, was covered with thick theatrical powder, but it stood out like a ridge of jagged ice. It was her mark on him, the only thing about their union that was honest. During the ceremony, the clergyman's voice sounded like distant thunder, a low, unintelligible rumble. Beatrice felt herself detaching from her body, watching the scene from the high, vaulted rafters. When a moment came for the I do, her voice didn't sound like her own. It was a dry, hollow whisper, a sound stripped of all hope and humanity. She felt the gold band of the Harrington ring snap shut around her finger. It didn't feel like jewelry. It felt like a cold, definitive shackle. The sacrifice was consummated before the god of the empire and the men of the bank. At the banquet that followed, The elite of London celebrated the triumph of order. They sipped the finest champagne while the bride remained motionless at the head of the table, an ice statue in the center of a decadent storm. Her father laughed. Harrington boasted of his new estates, and the world of 1890 went on as if the blood on the docks had never happened. But the wedding night held the final, inevitable act of this macabre play. Harrington, fueled by a dangerous mixture of vintage port and the burning desire to completely humiliate the woman who had dared to defy him, led Beatrice to the master chambers of his mansion. He locked the heavy oak door with a click that resonated through her very bones. He wanted her broken. He wanted to hear the pleas, the tears, and the begging that she had denied him at the altar. He began to strip her of her jewelry with brutal, clumsy hands, his breath hot and smelling of wine. He spoke of his victory. He mocked Arthur, calling him a beast of burden and describing with sickening, graphic detail how a man like that struggles to breathe when his lungs fill with the silt of the river. He told her she was lucky to have a master who would still take her after she had been sullied by a commoner. Beatrice remained silent, a ghost in white silk, letting him speak, letting him believe he had finally conquered the sterling fire. As he turned his back to remove his coat, confident in his dominance, Beatrice reached for the small silver dagger that Mary, the loyal scullery maid, had hidden beneath the heavy silk pillow lining that morning. It was a small, sharp blade used for cutting fruit, but in that moment, it was the only piece of truth in the entire house. The metal was cold, honest, and sharp. Beatrice did not hesitate. There was no grand cinematic drama, no final exchange of words. There was only the raw, physical precision of someone who had already died once and had nothing left to lose. The impact of the blade against Harrington's chest was a dull, sickening thud. The shock in his eyes, as he looked down at the silver handle, was the only pleasure Beatrice had felt in years. He fell back onto the expensive Persian rug, his life's blood, red, hot, and undeniable, staining the white satin of her wedding dress. The crimson spread across the pearls, creating a perfect, horrific symmetry with the blood of Arthur she had carried on her hands just 24 hours before. Beatrice did not flee the room. She did not scream for help. She walked slowly out onto the stone balcony, the same balcony that overlooked a city that had tried to crush her soul. She looked at her blood-stained hands in the moonlight and felt a profound, terrifying calm. The scandal that London so feared, the breaking of the social order, had reached its bloody zenith. She knew the servants would find him in the morning. She knew the gallows of Newgate would be her final destination, and that her name would be erased from the family Bibles or whispered as a cautionary tale of Victorian horror. But as she heard the distant, muffled sounds of the city waking up, she closed her eyes and imagined the Thames. She imagined the water carrying her away, past the docks, past the masonry yards, to where Arthur was waiting. She imagined a place where stone and silk held no power over the heart. Beatrice's sacrifice had not been for love alone. It was a sacrifice for the dignity of no longer being an object on a monster's shelf. When the London police finally broke down the door, they found her sitting calmly before the vanity, her face smeared with the red evidence of her crime, smiling into the void of the mirror. The lineage of the Sterlings and the Harringtons ended there, in a pool of blood, silk, and pearls. Years later, the story of the Bride of Rotherhithe became a staple of London folklore. They said that on nights when the fog was thickest, a figure in a tattered, blood-stained wedding dress could be seen walking the edge of the piers, searching for a ghost in a stone-dusted tunic. The mansion was eventually torn down, the Baron died a beggar, and the empire moved on. But the stones of the docks, the ones Arthur had laid with his own strong hands, remained. They guarded the secret of a romance that was strong enough to destroy 2 houses and set a soul free. The sacrifice was total. The silence, at last, was eternal.